who's going to talk about kind of how we engage politically. So over to you.
Thank you very much. I hope you can all see me and see the screen as well there that I've set up. Thank you, Graham, for organising. Thanks for the thumbs up there as well. I've found these sessions really, really helpful and really interesting. Great talks. I really appreciate the organisation of this event. It's been a really valuable discussion to have. So I've been asked to talk about the political and legal engagement aspects of this. And so in 15 minutes, I'm going to talk first about the recent history, what happened over the last few months, and then about some of the key points at stake in terms of the issues involved in this, and then suggest some lessons learned as well from the process. So let's go into it. So it's really interesting. We've lived through a really sort of interesting and striking period of British church history where the state made church meetings illegal for the first time for many, many centuries. A really remarkable thing, a really stunning thing to happen. The state closing churches, enforced closure of churches from March the 23rd, actual criminal sanctions for opening your building for worship is actually what we were faced with here. Churches could open, but only for social services like food banks and blood donation. If you had a prayer meeting before those services, that would have been illegal. No matter how many precautions you took, that would have been illegal. Meanwhile, we had supermarkets, off licenses, various manufacturing services, bicycle repair services, all these things deemed as essential. And Christian ministry is not essential, but you can do the social things. That's what you can do. We supported 25 church leaders up and down the country in a legal challenge to this act of the government, and sent a letter before action in May to the government saying that we thought this was illegal in terms of what they were doing, that there was 25 ranging different Anglicans, including Bishop Michael Nazarali, who spoke out very courageously at the beginning of the lockdown against closing churches, and Melvin Tinker from the Anglican spectrum. They have people like David Hathaway from the charismatic Pentecostal type of tradition, and Matthew Ashimolowo from the black churches, quite a few different black church leaders, and leaders from a wide range of different traditions who took part in this, collaborated together in this legal action. And you can read the letter before action on our website. Actually, it's freely available, and I can send the link round if you're interested. And we also submitted expert reports on the safety of churches gathering, arguing that churches can be made at least as safe as supermarkets or off licenses, for example, and an expert report on the theological issues involved and the importance of gathered worship together for Christianity and Christian ministry. There were various legal exchanges with the government over the next couple of months, and a private roundtable with our clients took place, which allowed them to express their views to the government. And then one of the letters requested a stay on the legal action on the basis the restrictions would be lifted. That was a letter dated the 24th of June. And then finally on July the 7th, we got a letter from the government which said, and I quote, accordingly with effect from the 4th of July 2020, there is no legal restriction in respect of the opening of places of worship, including churches. So the government basically completely backed down and then explained that the legal action is now moot or academic because the restrictions have been lifted, and therefore suggested that we should drop the legal claim with no costs awarded, which is in the end what we decided to do. And of course, in the meantime, the government's promised not to close churches again, which we believe is very much due to this legal action, pointing out that they acted well outside their authority and outside legal provisions, stretching all the way back to Magna Carta, Bill of Rights, freedom of religion, freedom of religious expression, all of that kind of thing was breached in a very significant way. And then, of course, more recently, we've had the open letter to the Prime Minister, First and Deputy First Ministers already referred to, signed by over 800 church leaders. Just to quote a couple of sentences from that, first of all, the public worship of Christian church is a particularly essential for our nation's well-being, obviously using the word that the government used there, saying that church is essential and should be regarded as essential. And then we therefore state categorically we must not be asked to suspend Christian worship again. For us to do so would cause serious damage to our congregations, our services of the nation, and our duty as Christian ministers. So we welcome this initiative and the fact that it was signed by so many different church leaders, and the message that it sent to our leaders and the government and politicians and to the nation that worship is important and that worship is essential, and the strong unified voice that it represented as well. And of course, the government has said that they're going to try and keep schools, universities, and places of worship, including churches, open, partly at least, as a result of these initiatives. So what are the key points at stake as we think about this? Well, the first one, I think, is the independence of church and state. I think that we would all agree that the church does not meet by permission of the state. We don't need the state's authority, we don't require the state's authority, and if we don't have the state's authority, that's not really the important issue here. We meet under God's authority, and that's why we meet, and that's how we meet. And the independence of church and state is enshrined in law in multiple ways, and it's fundamental to the UK's constitution. And therefore, when the government said that churches are banned and actually criminalised for meeting, they massively broke the constitution and disregarded centuries of heritage in this nation of freedom of religion and independence of church and state. And of course, the independence of church and state is also a biblical principle that we would defend from various passages in scripture. The point here is that if advice for churches is welcome, criminal sanctions are not. We're very happy to receive advice and to look at advice and take advice from the government, but criminal sanctions is where it overstepped the mark, oversteps its authority. The government does not have the authority to close churches in this way. Then the other issue is the importance of Christian public worship and ministry. This has been discussed already, particularly eloquently by Matthew Roberts. And the point that we were trying to make here is that Christian ministry should be viewed as essential. Essential to the church, essential for Christian ministry, essential for the nation, essential for individuals. There's nothing more important than worshiping God, and gathering worship and gathering to worship God is what we were created to do. And it was somewhat insulting for churches to be left to are open after DIY stores and less important than off licenses and so on. This is a really awful position for the church to be put in the nation. And this is what we were trying to push back against and criticize. Then you have the issue of freedom of religion. And that's, again, a very cherished principle, a very important principle enshrined in law in the European Convention of Human Rights. The state should not inhibit freedom of religion by closing churches, as it did. That is outside the state's realm of authority. It's outside what the state should do. If churches themselves decide to close, they can do that. But this is not for the state to say, and it's a very significant breach of freedom of religion. And of course, there are also international implications here, because the precedent that our government has now closed churches for a few months carries implications for our advocacy of freedom of religion around the world. Other countries close churches and we say, no, you shouldn't close churches, that's a breach of freedom of religion. They then point the finger back and say, but you close churches. We say, oh, that was for health and safety. And those other nations will say, well, that's exactly why we close churches as well. So our international advocacy of freedom of religion has been seriously undermined by the state closing churches in this country. Another key point is that Christians have a duty to God over the state. This obviously links in with the kind of things that John Stevens and others have been discussing already. But my point is that ministers should not be forced to halt Christian ministry by the state. The Bible instructs believers to meet and fellowship and various other things without exemptions for pandemics or plagues. It doesn't say, oh, but don't do this if there's a plague. Oh, don't do this if there's a pandemic or an infectious disease or something like that. It says there's a priority and important thing. And in fact, these instructions are given in times of persecution when it was dangerous, is dangerous for Christians to meet, and still the instruction stood. And Christians, of course, throughout the centuries have risked their lives for fellowship in various ways. And we should honour that, and they are honoured in church history for doing so. I agree with everyone else that there can be valid reasons for churches not to meet temporarily, but for months is a serious question. Of course, Daniel was restricted from praying for 30 days, and he didn't say, oh, well, perhaps I'll just do virtual prayer or pretend to be praying when I pretend not to be praying when I'm praying. No, he went and prayed anyway, even though it was a time limited system. So, and what are the lessons learnt then from our experience here? Well, I think one important lesson is that government overstepped in shutting down churches. I don't think that was deliberate. I think the government panicked and accidentally bulldozed through the constitution. And I think that our legal case and the letter before action and various other legal exchanges brought this to their attention. And as a result, and as well because of the open letter, they now say that they will not close churches and places of worship again. And I think that's very significant and welcome. And I really hope that that stands. However, whatever happens in the next few months, that churches continue to be allowed to meet. Second lesson is freedoms need to be fought for. Only Christians can really speak up about the importance of gathered public Christian ministry and Christian freedoms in this country, and that is what we need to do. And Christians cherish the independence of church and state, and only Christians can really talk about that and proclaim that and witness to the importance of that and tell people about that and witness as well that worship is worth it. Worship is worth it. Yes, there are risks involved, but we don't live in a risk-free world, and worship is worth a risk. It's worth taking risks for. Freedom's not fought for, our freedoms forfeited. We need to always keep fighting for these freedoms when they are challenged. And then virtual church is not real church. Again, this has already been spoken about, so I'm not going to dwell very much on this. I do think that lockdown has been harmful for church ministry. I think we're all agreed about that. I'm really saddened that so many people have not experienced gathered worship since the lockdown, like for 6 months or so. I mean, the message I'm getting from churches, interested to hear other opinions, is about 30% of their church members have come back to gathered worship. And the other thing I'm disappointed about is that most of those churches, as far as I can see, are not singing. And singing is guidance and not law. It's not singing is guidance from the government. It's not law from the government. And people, again, through church history and still today, risk their lives by singing in gathered worship. And the UK church is saying, oh, we better not sing because it's government guidance. I find that very disturbing. The increased presence online is a side benefit. I think many churches have risen to the challenge on that and done live streaming when they didn't do it before and increased their presence. I think that's good. Although I think that we will need to think about hate speech laws and the way they're going and the wisdom of putting up all your sermons online, the way that the state is going on these kind of issues. And health and safety is not the gospel. I think that, Douglas Murray and Tom Holland have been mentioned already. Our message has got to be that some things are more important than health and safety. We risk in our society being governed by fear rather than the Bible, and I speak personally to myself about that. I got a call from the NHS as a vulnerable person. You should not put the bins out. They said, that's a risk for you. And I felt fear grip my heart at that moment. So I was like, gosh, it's too risky for me to put the bins out. And I had to think, no, I'm not going to be governed by this fear. I can wash my hands if I need to. And this is all right. And my wife is rather more at risk with me with diabetes and stage 4 cancer that is incurable. And yesterday she was leading a youth group in person because that's what she's decided she should do. She doesn't want to stay at home and just live in fear. She wants to go and make a difference. And if it shortens her life, so be it. But worship is worth it. And Christian ministry is worth it, is sort of the point here. And of course, even non-Christians were appalled at the closure of churches and sometimes at the reaction of churches and the things churches were saying. But another lesson is that churches have been provoked to increase political engagement, and I welcome this. And that's both our legal action and the open letter by church leaders recently. And I think that's good. And I hope that that continues and that people continue in that way. And I also think that it's good that we're having a healthy discussion about civil disobedience and where we stand on that. Helpful discussion we've had today about that as well. And I think that's needed when it hasn't been needed in the UK for many generations, of course, but it's needed now. And I'm reminded of Gallio saying about Paul, this man is persuading people to worship God contrary to the law from Acts 18. And I wonder if that will one day be said of us. So I'm going to conclude there. I think that I'm pleased that lockdowns provoked increased political and legal engagement by churches. I think we have learnt various lessons. I'm agreeing with many of what other speakers have said here. And I do think that the church needs to speak prophetically to the nation about the importance of worship. And that is something that we, and only we, can really do. And I think we also need to ask, what is God saying and doing through this virus? And perhaps that's another question we can address another time.
Okay, thanks so much, Tim. Yeah, I'm responsible for moderating this section. The chat ribbon is going mad, so we'll try and deal with some of these questions. Just first of all, can we get this constitutional clarity? Yes, we have an established church, but the sort of constitutional right on which you were basing your legal engagement with the government was, first of all, Magna Carta, whose opening statement, the opening provision is, the English church shall be free and shall have its rights undiminished and its liberties unimpaired. This is to be observed by our heirs in perpetuity, in good faith in perpetuity. So what you're saying is that the good faith has gone, sort of thing, but the lockdown took away the, honouring that in perpetuity sort of thing, and that's a fundamental right. Was that a major part of your argument? I mean, I've seen the document that you put to the government.
Yeah, I mean, I encourage everyone to look at it, and I can send a link round to the letter before action that covered all the various legal arguments. In some ways, the point about Magna Carta is that this is a very long-standing thing in our constitution about freedom of religion and, more importantly, perhaps independence of church and state, and that the government doesn't have the right to dictate to the church about what it should and should not do. Like I said, government guidance is welcome and criminalisation is not. And that goes all the way back to the Magna Carta, but it also comes out in various other aspects of our laws as well. And so, we wanted to make use of these laws and this history and this backdrop and point it all out to the government and say, look, we think you've overstepped in this. We think you've broken various constitutional provisions here, and you should stop that and listen to it.
Now, obviously, Magna Carta is prior to any of the Acts of Union, unless I'm not too sure about the Welsh legal history there, but certainly it's pre the Act of Union with Scotland or with Ireland. Does everything you've shared legally apply in Scotland?
I don't know. I don't know. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to comment in detail about the law. I'm sorry to disappoint you if that's the case. Yeah, okay. I mean, I think the legal arguments are important. I think in some ways the moral argument is almost more important about this. And that's sort of really the point we're trying to make. There's legal arguments which are important and at issue, but there's also a moral argument around should the state interfere in this kind of way with its churches.
I'm getting lots of questions and comments shared with everyone, and I'm kind of losing some of the right. How do you justify your understanding of the English constitution when non-conformist churches had to be granted toleration by the state? There has never been freedom in the sense suggested by Christian Concern. Are you reading the US constitution into the UK constitution?
Well, I think there's also the Declaration of Human Rights and freedom of religion, which is enshrined in our laws as well. That does imply this kind of freedom and independence as well in our constitution. And so I think that this is implied, and the way in which the interaction between the church and state, the established church, and then the non-conformist churches as well, I think is implied in there. But again, I'm not a legal expert, so I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to comment in detail about these legal arguments.
And the Human Rights Act pits one set of rights against another, doesn't it? And so often the right to religious freedom suffers at the hands of the right to freedom of speech or freedom to right to a private life, or what have you.
Yes, and indeed, of course, there are safety safety issues, as in it says in there that for safety issues, some of these rights can be inhibited. But we would argue that this would be a decision from the church rather than for the state to make in this case.
Okay. Interestingly, lots of comments on the chat stream, sort of more generally, but very few being sent through to Matthew. If you want to send a question to Matthew, that's fine. Do you think we should speak more with one voice? Is there a danger that we end up being lots of Christians fighting with each other, and people see our disagreements in public? sort of
Yeah, and
thing.
I think there is a danger of that, and I'm concerned about it. And so I welcome this kind of discussion that we can have in-house, so to speak, to discuss this kind of thing and debate it and try and reach some agreement about it. And I also welcome initiatives like the open letter that got hundreds of signatures from church leaders that displayed a very strong unity. And I think that as far as possible, we do need to try and demonstrate a unity around this, but also recognize that we will disagree, perhaps, for example, with the established church in the nation about their view of this kind of thing, and sometimes have to criticize them, which might look to the outside world like disagreement between Christians, but at the same time, there are fundamental differences here, aren't there?
Okay, you said that the Bible's instruction to us to gather doesn't vary for pandemic or plague, but where does the Bible give any specific advice on how to live as the people of God during a time of pandemic or plague?
Well, I'm trying to think where it does. Maybe someone else can help me on that. I think that, there are rules about infectious diseases, aren't there, in Leviticus and so on, and about precautions around those and ways of determining whether somebody's infectious and all of that kind of thing. And I think so, we can read out of that we take precautions and, we're careful and we take reasonable precautions and we do social distancing and cleansing and hygiene and all of that kind of thing. And I think that's helpful. And I think that all churches are doing that kind of thing. So that's where I would go, I think, with that.
Now, in Scripture, we have two very different approaches at the end of Luke and at the end of Acts. At the end of Luke, Jesus is quiet, silent at his trial. At the end of Acts, Paul is not, and he defends himself and he stands up for his rights as a Roman citizen and so on. Which of those should guide us more, really, in terms of our public engagement? Is there a danger that if we shout too loud and we campaign too hard, that we actually compromise our witness?
Well, I think that living in a democracy, we have the opportunity to make our voice heard, and that's and legal rights as well to make use of. And I think that our voice is often muted in various ways, and so then when we do say something, it can perhaps look like we're shouting, but it's not necessarily. That might look like we're shouting in this in-house environment, whereas out in the big world out there, it doesn't look like a very large voice very often, I think. So I'm not sure shouting is really the thing that comes across necessarily to the outside world about this. But I think, we do need to do it with respect and grace and humility in the right way as well, and make sure that we're, speaking in those ways and with those motivations as well. And I think hopefully that will come across if that's the case.
And what about a legal duty to protect the vulnerable? Now, that we tend to think of that in terms of, we must encourage vulnerable people to isolate, but actually isolation may be the very thing they don't need. For example, if they have dementia, that actually what they need is social interaction, or if they have mental health problems, locking down is actually very damaging. What about legal duties in that situation, and how do we encourage a balancing there?
Yes, I mean, I think that at the moment, many people are too governed by fear, and that's my concern about this. Whether that is people who are vulnerable on the one hand, or people who are wanting to help those who are vulnerable on the other hand, both of them can be governed by fear in terms of what they think they should do and think they're allowed to do. There are provisions, as John Stevens was indicating, for helping people in these situations, forming a bubble or forming a support group and all of that kind of thing. And I think we should do that. And I think we need to meet with these people, talk to them, maybe remotely sometimes, but maybe in person some other times as well, and discuss and talk through these issues with them and try and break through some of the fear, but also encourage people to take reasonable precautions in these kind of things. And I think there are real very big side issues in terms of the effects of lockdown and so on people's mental health and social issues, particularly for the elderly, and that's a very serious concern that churches need to be acting on and speaking into.
We tend to think of your work particularly as engaging national government. For a lot of us locally, the issue is actually not the national government, but our local authority, because our churches are meeting in properties run by local authorities.
Yeah.
And that's a huge frustration for many of us, in that we cannot get into a school to meet on a Sunday, and in our case, local community centres are being run by the local authority, and they just aren't opening them up. There is, and that's actually having a detrimental effect on a whole range of community activity, isn't it? How do we go about engaging our local authorities? They seem a bit more faceless than national government.
Yeah, no, I think it's very difficult, and I totally sympathise with that. I mean, my church also was hiring a school which can't meet. We can't meet in that school at the moment. I think that what it shows is the value of building relationships with these people over time. If you're using their properties, try and build relationships with them so that you can have an open discussion and speak to them and talk to them about these issues. And the relationship is there to establish the lines of communication and then also, you know, try and demonstrate the benefits of church to the society, the benefits of church to the community in the various things that you're doing, and be able to demonstrate that in the various things that you're doing. And I think that's important as well. We need to advocate that for that at the local level. That is down to local churches, and local churches need to be doing that with their local authorities, local politicians, and the places where they're meeting as well. And I think that's very important. But I agree, it's very, very difficult for churches that don't own a building at the moment, and I totally sympathise. All I can say is try and engage and try and talk to them about the importance of your ministry.
Mm-hmm. Two more questions, then I think we need to make way for Mr. Gobbett, which is very important. Do you think that legal challenge in the courts is more effective, or is it better to do softer campaigning, dialogue with government, talking with the people who are making the regulations? Which is more important?
Yeah, well, I think you need both, but I think that in the case of the government, in this kind of case, actually, you know, setting out the legal arguments in a letter like this is a way to initiate the discussion at a more sort of deeper level, at a meaningful level. So you start off by saying, look, here's the legal arguments, here's the points that you've done, here's how we think you've broken the law. Let's talk about this. Can we reach a resolution here? And in the end, of course, we didn't go to court. You know, the case was dropped and so on. And we believe that they capitulated partly as a result of that. You know, so that is a way to engage with government in these kind of ways. But of course,
do you think it was mostly because of Christian Concerns litigation, threatened litigation, or do you think it was the wider dialogues that were going on through the church's main committee and so on? I
think it was both, but I think the Christian Concern legal initiative made a difference and was significant and set out the arguments in a way that other people were not doing.
Mm-hmm. Final question. Is now the time to start meeting in homes sort of underground, as believers do in some other countries, and sing and do everything according to scripture? And if not now, when is that time? And very interestingly, just to mention, I know a church in China which has been meeting online. Whenever certain words are used in their online service, the live link just cuts out completely, and they have one service where that happened 5 or 6 times in one service. So, you know, in a Chinese context, they're using technology to censor churches, which is a different scenario altogether. But, you know, is it appropriate in our setting to start meeting in homes regardless and disregarding the rules?
Well, I'm very glad that at the moment churches are not closed, right? So churches can meet, and, you know, let's take advantage of that. Let's use that where we have buildings that we can do that. Let's meet and let's do that in whatever ways we can. I think there are real questions to be asked about how long one puts up with the rule of 6 that says I can't visit my father, or I can't visit my children, or I can't, you know, and I can't meet with other people and so on. I think there are real questions to be asked about that and think about that, and I want to sort of leave that hanging at the moment as a conscience issue for people as to when you decide it's right to violate some of these rules around these issues. You'll have seen Lord Sumption saying that he doesn't know anybody who's planning to obey those rules. And that's very significant for a former Supreme Court judge to say that. You know, so I wonder how enforceable these laws are, and how much the rule of law is being undermined by arbitrary laws being changed week by week, and people think, well, I just can't live like this anymore. And I think that's another sort of side effect of this whole system we've got ourselves into here.
Okay, thank you, Tim. Let's head back to Graham and to the final session.
Brilliant. Thank you.